Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this presentation today on the impact of media use on adolescent cognitive and behavioral development. And so, my name is Iran Kemp, and this presentation is going to be geared towards adolescents and adolescent audience. And the reason for this is my goal here is to equip adolescents with a sense of knowledge, I guess. A knowledge and understanding of their own cognition and their own behaviors. So, we're going to explore that in the context of various sorts of media, television, social media. We're mostly going to focus on those, but I will expand on that a little bit based off of the research that will be presented to you. So let's go ahead and get started with some just a few small general statistics. So this is relatively new. In 2016, the average 12th grader spends twice as much time online than in 2006 and 6 hours a day on social media. So that's pretty staggering. And I would probably even suspect that those numbers are even higher than that. I'm guessing at least by now in 2018, it's got to be more than twice as much than 2006. But the main thing I want to highlight here before we get into the rest of this presentation is the idea of teens spending a lot of time online. So, a lot of previous research mainly focused on television. Television, as we know today, is not just sitting in front of the TV screen. Television has now been taken digital. We can watch television on our smartphones, tablets, laptops. So, in the scope of the research in this presentation, some of it you'll see is like talking about television, but I do want to highlight that it's not just specifically, the box in your living room, right? Because we now know today that television goes beyond that. So just keep that in mind as we go through this presentation today. So, the very first thing I want to bring our minds to is some quotes, some very profound quotes, basically describing or talking about the things that we look at changes who we are. So, the first quote here on the left is by Ellen G. White from First Selected Messages, which says, by beholding, we are to become changed. And as we meditate upon the perfections of the divine model, we shall desire to become wholly transformed and renewed in the image of His purity, which is Christ. It is by faith in the Son of God that transformation takes place in the character, and the child of wrath becomes the child of God. So now this quote has actually been very popular among many Christian denominations, and the very fact of it is because it's true, right? We see this in Scripture. Just the beginning portion of this quote, by beholding we are to become changed, we can be changed into the image of God in His glory, or we can be changed into the image of Satan. And I think that that's a very, very important aspect to keep in mind as we move forward. And the next quote here we have from Matthew 5:29, which comes from Jesus himself, which kind of goes hand in hand with our quote on the left by Ellen G. White. And Jesus said, actually, he said this a few times throughout the Gospels, about 2 or 3 times. And he says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. So now we know Jesus is not counseling for us to rip our eyes out, right? Even back then, they used metaphors and analogies, and that's exactly what Christ is using here. Basically, what he's saying, if what you're beholding, if what you're watching is causing you to stumble, or if it's causing you to sin, if it's causing you to move further and further away from righteousness and into unrighteousness, then you got to get rid of that, because that's going to totally change your character. And we know as Christians our character is to be totally and wholly transformed, as we read here, and renewed in the image of His purity. So it's very, very important that we be careful with what we look at. and what we allow ourselves to be exposed to. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. You'll find some interesting things about what happens when we're exposed to things that are not in our best interest. So we're going to move right into a study here that I've labeled "Monkey See, Monkey Do." That little phrase actually fits totally well with this study that we're going to look at. And so this study here was conducted by D. Pellegrino and his colleagues, and it was about this concept of mirror neurons. But now they weren't specifically looking for this, and I'm going to explain what mirror neurons are. This is actually a term that they've coined, but they were looking for something totally different and ended up finding something even more interesting. So, what was done in this study was that they were studying a monkey, basically, and they were hooking up this monkey to a machine, studying his brain, imaging and functioning and things of that nature. And the monkey, his objective was to pick up an object, let's say it was a banana. Actually, they gave him different objects to pick up, and they wanted to see what part of his brain lit up, basically, or what part of his brain was activated. And they found that every time this monkey picked up an object, basically the parts or regions of his brain that have to do with movement, or the motor cortex, was activated. But now something else interesting happened when the researchers were not even really paying attention. So what happened was, as the monkey sat there, still hooked up to this machine, when he was observing an experimenter or one of the researchers reach and grab an object, it was shown on an EEG, which was this monitor that they hooked up to him, into his brain, that the same motor neuron, so this is having to do with movement, that activated when the monkey grabbed something actually went off or activated when the monkey just watched the experimenter or the researcher pick up something. So we can actually look at this little illustration here. This is based off of that study. And so as we first talked about, when the monkey picked up an object, let's say he picked up the banana, parts or regions of his brain that have to do with movement activated, which would make sense, right? Because his hand is moving, he's making a good grabbing motion, and he's picking up something. So in the brain, what happens is before you actually even do that, there's a process that goes on in your brain where it says, okay, I'm getting ready to pick up something. And so that's what happened with this monkey. But now, when the researchers were actually kind of stepped away, weren't really paying attention, but they were alerted to the monitor going off, was when an experimenter was just picking up an object, probably trying to move it somewhere else, but the monkey was watching the experimenter pick up that object or that banana in this example. And what happened was the same regions of his brain that have to deal with his own movement activated. So, in other words, when the monkey was watching this researcher, his brain, you can interpret it as his brain was saying, I'm picking up that banana, but he really wasn't doing it. And the reason why we interpret it that way, and the reason why these researchers interpreted it that way, is because the only reason, or so we had thought, that your motor region of your brain should be activating is when you actually do something. But this time the monkey wasn't doing anything. He was just watching this researcher do something, and his brain was saying, I'm doing that. And so that's really, really interesting. And the researchers found this very interesting as well, in the context of monkeys. And then they took it even further to look at this with humans. Because we can look at this and say, well, what does that have to do with me, right? I'm not a monkey. We're not monkeys. How does that relate to my own brain? And we're going to take a look at that in the next few slides. But now, these researchers, so based off of what they saw in their experiment, they coined this region of his brain, the monkey's brain, mirror neurons. So what happens when you look in a mirror, right? You see yourself, right? If you pick up your hand and you start waving it in front of the mirror, your reflection does the same thing. So that's why they called it mirror neurons, because his own motor neurons were mirroring what he was seeing being done. And so now we want to know, does this happen in the human mind as well? So as we continue, we will look into that. But really quick, I want to go into the functionality. So, according to that study and further Rizzolatti and Craig Hero, they found that there were two main functions that activate or that happen with this whole mirror neuron thing. So, this is like the role of mirror neurons. And those two main functions were imitation and action understanding. So imitation in the sense of, imitating someone else's behavior, and action understanding now where you actually take that where you actually perform that action. So let's even look at this little model here. Don't get caught up in all of the technical terminology. We won't be looking at that. We're just going to look at this general flow of what happens with the role of mirror neurons. So, imitation, right? So you're imagining, well, actually, before we even get to that, look at this little diagram here. There's two people. You've got the blue guy and the red guy. The red guy, he looks like he's getting ready to pick up a cup of coffee, and the blue guy is watching him do that. So you have the observation that's taking place, right? So the blue guy, he sees him reaching for the cup, getting ready to pick up the cup of coffee. And then we have the imitation process, which largely goes on first in the mind or in your brain. So you imagine how you would make that same movement. So your brain is actually interpreting it as you doing it because you're imagining yourself doing it now. And it's really not you, it's the red guy, right? It's not the blue guy. And then action understanding. I understand that you want to take a sip of coffee. So as he's watching the red guy pick up or get ready to pick up the cup of coffee, he's imagining himself doing that and understanding that this guy wants to take a sip of coffee. So in return, he's imagining himself doing that. So that's kind of mirror neurons in a nutshell. We will return to the concept of mirror neurons as we move forward, as we look more into um, media in particular, and cognition, and behavioral responses and development as well. All right, so now human implications. So remember, in the other previous slide before the last one, we were saying, well, what does this have to do with me? I'm not a monkey, right? You guys are not monkeys. You are human beings, totally separate and distinct. Really, the thing is, with the whole mirror neuron thing with the monkeys, they found the same thing in humans. So they didn't find specifically single neurons in the brain, so single, you know, motor neurons. But what they found was that the whole motor cortex seems to activate when humans are basically experiencing the same things that the monkey did. And so what they found was that observation, so observing someone doing something, it activates the motor cortex or the regions of your brain that have to do with movement, in other words. So they did the same study with humans, and they basically found the same thing, but it went a little further than just what they found in the monkey study. What they also found in this human study that Rizzolatti and Craig Hero did was that meaningless movements also activate the motor cortex. So meaningless movements, these researchers described it as the like when you're just reaching for something, when you're not actually picking up something, or when you're just contemplating doing something, and actually not just contemplating it, but like your actions display, I'm getting ready to do something, but you don't do it. So the researchers found that specifically in humans, the same thing happens as what happens with the monkeys. But even further than that, not even completing the action activates the movement parts of your brain, or the parts that have to do with movement. So in other words, not only does someone else's actions get interpreted as you doing it in your brain, but even someone's lack of action. So it's the intent actually causes you to think, I'm intending to do that. So that's kind of what happens with your brain in general, right? Observing pretty much anything. Keep all of this in mind when we get to the slides that have to do with specifically television and things of that nature. Hopefully this whole concept of mirror neurons will make even more sense to you, and even as we look through some other studies as well. So now that we have a basic understanding of mirror neurons in the context of humans, how does that, or what does that have to do with our brain waves. So there's a connection there too, in a sense, especially when we look at television. So when you're watching and you're observing something happen on the television screen, let's say, for example, you're watching a movie, and in that movie, someone decides to shoot someone. Well, as you're looking at that, consciously, sorry, your brain is saying, I'm shooting that person. And so this doesn't mean that you're actually going to get up and get a gun and one day shoot someone. It doesn't mean that at all. What we're going to find is that things like that lead to desensitization. So we're going to look at that a little further, but keep this thought in mind. What I look at on television, what I look at really on any screen, affects me. And it affects me in a very personal way because my brain is telling me that I'm doing this thing, not the other person per se. Like it says, it sees the other person doing it, but it's also saying I'm doing that. And what does that eventually do to our brain? So let's look at brain waves in general. We're not looking at all of the brain waves. There's also like another one, but we're just going to look at beta, alpha, theta, and delta. We're going to focus on alpha. So beta, this is when we're engaged in focused activity. So by the way, all of these brain waves, we experience all of them every day, and that's perfectly normal. So like I said, beta is focused activity. This is like when we're reading, when we're engaged in a conversation, like especially a stimulating conversation, even when we're maybe watching a healthy debate, things of that nature. This is basically the state that we are mostly in, or that we should mostly be in. About 70 to 90%, according to Miller, we should be in this state. Most people are in this state 70 to 90% of the day. Mostly you're focused, right? Hopefully when you are at school you're focused, right? So things of that nature. So again, even like when you're learning, that you would be in beta. Okay, so now alpha, this is another brain wave that we are also in throughout the day. This is a relaxed state. This is our inattentive state, where we are not really focused, but we're kind of just in the moment, I'd say. And so that's why they call this the relaxed state. It doesn't have to do with thinking too much. You're kind of just chill, basically, right? And that's good, right? We should have moments where we are relaxed. We're going to return to alpha. That's why I have it in red. And now theta happens, we get into this brain wave when we're falling asleep, or when we're daydreaming, and also when we're actually dreaming. So this is when you start getting sleepy, you're preparing yourself for bed, or if you're walking, throughout the day, you may start daydreaming, you may drift off. So you may go from beta, focused and relaxed. Focused, then relax, like go into alpha, and then you may drift off and daydream about what you're going to have for lunch while you're sitting in class, something of that nature. All of this is totally normal, perfectly fine. And then delta is deep sleep. So this is when you're knocked out, pretty much, on your bed, knocked out, sleeping. So now returning back to alpha, as I mentioned before, alpha is not bad to be in a relaxed state. Alpha is, like I have an example here. Let's say you're walking through the park and you look at some really pretty flowers, or you're walking through the park and you're looking at the trees, you're looking at nature. This produces an alpha state. You go from, let's say maybe you were previously in beta, but now as you're walking through maybe a garden or something like that, you get put in alpha. You're very relaxed, very inattentive, just kind of going with the flow kind of thing. Perfectly normal, very healthy in some cases, but we're going to look at some cases where alpha is actually not so healthy. So as we lead up to that, we're going to focus here on this study that was done. I call it Beep Beep, No One's There. And the reason I am calling this is that in this particular study that was done, the participants, they were asked to wear a pager or a beeper. Some of you may not know what that is, and that's totally fine, right, for your age. But I have a picture of one, okay? Totally different from our cell phones today, right? And so they were asked to wear this pager, and it would beep. It would beep at varied times. And their job was to record what they were doing and how they were feeling. So this first study was actually focused on adolescents. There were adults as well, but it goes through this like kind of break off from the study to actually focusing on one particular high school senior. So they had this beeper, and interestingly enough, this beeper, when I was finding this picture online, it's actually called Alpha Elite. It totally, by mistake, didn't know it was called that until I found it and actually put it in this presentation. So that's interesting, right? Because as we go through this study and the follow-up study, we're going to look more at alpha. But anyway, they were supposed to record how they were feeling every time it beeped throughout their day, right? Happy, joyful, content, whatever they were feeling, based off of what they were doing and experiencing. And so the study focuses on this high school senior named Lorraine. And Lorraine, she reported feeling happy when talking to her friends, when she was in class, and her particular favorite show, which was Miss America. So in this particular study, Lorraine happened to suffer a disappointment at some point throughout the study. And there was a drastic change in her mood. It wasn't like, oh, that kind of sucks, and all right, I'll just get over it. No, she actually went from like very, very happy to extremely sad and depressed in such a way. And they were wondering what happened to her. So, like, the thing that she went through that disappointed her should pretty much disappoint any teenager. She didn't get a chance to go on this study trip that she wanted to go on. But the drastic change in her mood was what confused these researchers. So what they actually asked themselves in this study was, you know, might her response to disappointment be because of her television watching? And they also listed a few other things like, her basic evaluation on what happened to her. Maybe it was a combination of these things. But they did report that she watched television most of the time throughout this study. Most of the time, she was watching TV, especially when this disappointment happened in her life. She stopped hanging out a lot with her friends and she kind of just stayed at home and was alone and was just watching television. And her mood drastically continued to decrease. And so these researchers actually asked in this study, like, did this have to do with her watching television? Like, is there something we're missing here? So, with that, there was a follow-up study. This follow-up study was done mostly with adults, working adults. So they didn't have much time to watch television. They actually reported that they did not watch television like very late. So like how most people would maybe stay up till 9, 10 watching television. They didn't do that. They just watched it kind of casually when they got home from work. So in this follow-up study, basically the same thing. They were given the beeper. They were supposed to report what they were doing and how they were feeling when this beeper went off. So same thing as the previous study. And what they specifically found that was very interesting to them was that watching TV. So every time they reported, "Oh, I'm just sitting around watching TV," it produced a very weak, passive, and drowsiness in them. So they all reported that they felt very weak. They felt very passive. They felt very drowsy. They didn't feel like they were very happy. So there was a moderate level of cheerfulness, but there was a high level of relaxation. They felt very relaxed while watching TV. And I know that that probably doesn't sound strange, right? We should feel uh, kind of relaxed when we're watching television because that's the whole purpose of it, right? And they also reported low concentration, which actually was detrimental to them. So this feeling of weakness, passiveness, not feeling very happy, low concentration, in return affected how they were working. So when they would get up, go to work, they didn't feel as great as they did like when they didn't watch television and go to work the next day. So that was also something very interesting. Every time they would watch TV, they'd feel like this, and when they get to work, they'd feel horrible. But now they also found, because they looked at public leisure activities as well, like let's say getting together with a couple friends or a few friends, playing soccer or whatever you like to do leisurely outside with friends, they found something very similar. So they found that whenever these participants reported that they were engaged in public leisure activities with their friends and things of that nature, they felt very relaxed there as well. So they're like, well, okay, so they're relaxed when they're watching TV, they're relaxed when they're engaged in public activities. So far, so good. But now, what they found is that they also felt very cheerful, they felt very sociable, they had a high level of concentration, they were very alert, they felt very strong, and they felt very active. And so, I guess in a general sense, we kind of look at this and say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that these people, while they were watching television, they were in alpha. Because remember, we just learned that alpha is this relaxation state of inattentiveness, right? You're just kind of not really paying attention. You're just going with the flow type of thing. But now, public leisure activities, they felt relaxed then too. But their concentration level was way up. They felt very active. They felt good in this relaxed state. So remember when we looked at that example of how alpha is not necessarily a bad state, and it's not. Like when we are, like the example I gave before, like if we're walking through the park, we're looking at flowers, we're looking at nature, the squirrels, things of that nature. You're in alpha and you feel very relaxed, but it's a good relaxation. And so they found a contrast here between this good alpha, pretty much, and this bad alpha. And the bad alpha seemed to be connected with watching television. And so, and I should also mention from this study and the ones that we'll see later on in this presentation, they kind of stayed in alpha. And is that good to stay in alpha? No. What we just learned previously was that we should mostly be in beta 70 to 90% of the day. But now, what happens when you're watching TV a good portion throughout the day? And I would also add to this not just watching television, but just literally watching a screen. So, like watching a movie on your laptop or a television show, whatever case it may be, Netflix. What happens when you're spending a large portion of your day doing that? You're staying in alpha. You're not focused, you're not functioning in beta, and that can be detrimental. So as we continue, we're going to look at this a little bit further. Okay, let's see, did I miss something here? Nope. Okay, sorry. So let's continue. Brain functioning. So we just looked at this whole idea of pretty much beta versus alpha and what state we should be in mostly, but what happens when we're watching television a large portion throughout the day, which is what a lot of teens do. I would pretty much say, based off of the statistical research that I showed you, spend a lot of time online, looking at videos, television, on the sense of being online. So it's not always, like I said, sitting in front of a television screen, but just any screen where you're watching something. So we looked at that contrast between the beta and the alpha. And so now let's look at our brain functioning as a whole, or I shouldn't say as a whole, but we're going to look at two contrasting systems. And we're going to look at how one of these systems is associated with alpha in a sense. So there was this study done by these researchers listed here. And what they found was that TV viewing was found to activate areas of the limbic system and suppress areas of the frontal lobe. So they basically were experimenting with people watching television and what happened to their brains as they were watching television. So they were hooked up to monitors and things of that nature. And so what do we mean by limbic system? What do we mean by frontal lobe? So before we explain specifically what these researchers saw, what happened to these people, let's understand what the frontal lobe is. So now, the frontal lobe is considered the emotional control center. Emphasis on control, right? Emotional control center, and the home of our personality. So there's a lot of things that the frontal lobe is engaged in: reasoning, planning, language, long-term memory, impulse control, problem solving, emotions, judgment, motor function, things of that nature. So this is why we call the frontal lobe our higher level thinking. Okay, this is connected with beta because beta is our higher functioning. This is when we're engaged in stimulating activity, right? That has to do with reasoning, right? So when you're engaged in a conversation with someone, you're in beta, you're reasoning, you guys are talking through something. Maybe you guys are planning something. So all of this has to do with our frontal lobe, and we're pretty much in beta. when we're going through these things. Okay, so remember in the study, they found that people who watch television a lot, pretty much, it had to do with the amount of television that they were watching. They were watching television a lot. The frontal lobe was suppressed, and what that means is that the functioning of the frontal lobe was not as high. So they weren't functioning, or they weren't activating parts of the frontal lobe as often as they should. So that's basically what suppression means. It's not being activated, it's not being utilized as much. And so now the limbic system is a little different. There's different parts associated with the limbic system, but its main function controls emotion, produces feelings, interprets sensory impulses, facilitates memory storage and retrieval, which is learning. So these are basically good things. To add to this, also what the study was talking about was that the limbic system is the base emotions, or like your base functioning. So the foundational functioning of who you are. So this has to do highly with your emotions, right? This is where your happiness, anger, sadness, fear, aggression, all of these emotions are stored in the limbic system. Also sex drive as well. And all of these things are fine, right? Even fear. There are times where we should experience fear. For example, if we are walking down the road and we see a snake, your brain should tell you, hey, that's a snake. I need to get out of here, right? So that's a healthy sense of fear. So we very much need our limbic system, but we don't need our limbic system controlling us. Or in other words, we don't need our limbic system to be what drives us. Okay, so what happened in this study is that, like I mentioned, the frontal lobe was suppressed, so the aspect of their reasoning, their higher intellect, also in the frontal lobe, by the way, is where our spirituality is housed. All of these things were suppressed in these people the more and more they engaged in watching television, watching movies, TV shows, but the limbic system was highly activated. So they were highly in an emotional state as they were watching television, which should come really to no surprise because, like, what happens when you're watching a scary movie? You become frightened or scared. What happens when you're watching a funny television show or a funny movie? You laugh, right? So your emotions are activated, which is not always a bad thing. But it can be a bad thing if you stay like that. So if you stay with your limbic system being activated, and the way you do that is to constantly watch television, as we learned from this study, that's not a good thing. Because now you're letting your emotions control you, and the frontal lobe should be controlling you. This is the governing system of our brain, the governing system of who we are. And we should have the governing system of who we are controlling us. We should have our reasoning and our intellect and our ability to discern things controlling us. Because what happens when you stay in the limbic system, you're not in control. And we're going to learn that in another study as we continue. But first, let's look at a few things that this particular study highlighted. So what they found was that the more people engaged in their television watching, 6+ hours of television watching, this is what happened. There was heightened levels of aggression. So not everybody was like physically aggressive, but what happens is people are on, think of a number line, for example. We're going to call this number line a threshold. And what happens is that there's some people that are further along on the threshold, and some people are way behind on the threshold. So those who are further along on this threshold of life, or of aggression in particular, they are more prone to actually act out in aggressive manners. And then there's other people who are not inclined to, really hurt someone, like kill someone, for example. But they're more inclined to just be upset a lot, to be, angry. Let's say you're driving, somebody cuts you off, you get really upset. Those types of things are people who are lower on the threshold. But irrespective of that, this study found that the limbic system was activated. People stayed in the limbic system, or the limbic system was governing them now. Their emotions were governing who they are. and they became more aggressive. So, heightened levels of aggression they found. They also found reduced higher functioning, like what we talked about. So, your higher functioning has to do with staying in beta or operating mostly in beta throughout the day, and also direct connection with your frontal lobe. So, they weren't able to reason. So, keep that in mind, by the way, because we're actually going to look at a study that looks at something along those lines. Watching television, not being able to reason what you're looking at. You can't decipher what you're looking at because your emotions are just controlling you. You're just being swept away with whatever emotion that the show or the movie is trying to incite in you. Okay? And another thing, overstimulation. So this study also saw overstimulation, and there was another study that actually used rats. So we looked at a study that used monkeys. We're going to look at a short clip of this study by Christakis, Ramirez, and Ramirez, where they used rats. And then I'm going to explain this a little further, okay? Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's look at the basic outline of this study. So, what happened was these researchers decided to take this group of mice, they were very young mice, and they basically put them in this area where they were subjected to audio from a television show or different television shows, really, and visual stimulation. So the visual stimulation was flashing lights, right, as this clip mentioned. The reason why the researchers did the connection with the television audio and the visual stimulation of the flashing lights is because what happens when you're watching a movie or a television show, it doesn't matter if you're looking at it on television or on your laptop, smartphone, what happens is you're basically staring at a bunch of flashing lights, especially with the television screen. So, just for some general knowledge, the television screen is basically staring at a box that has flashing lights, and you can't decipher how, you can't actually see the flashing lights because they're blinking so fast. Um, and what that does is that is basically what researchers find entraps people or ensnares people. In the particular study, they found that people were saying television puts them in the hypnotic state. The reason for that is literally because of the rapid movement in whatever it is that you're watching and the flashing lights. So that's why they combine the flashing lights with the audio from TV, because you can't really get, rats to sit down on a couch or a little tiny couch and watch television. So they had to simulate that, right? And they did it for 6 hours per day for a total of 42 days in particular. And so what they found was that these rats, or these mice, were overstimulated. It was like they were basically watching too much television, and it was causing it was causing issues in their brain functioning. They weren't able to function properly. They weren't doing what they would normally do. They were actually engaged in more risky behaviors, and their reasoning level, or the reasoning for a mouse, right, was not as developed. It was not as sound as what it should have been. So what researchers like to do is they like to take animals and decipher, well, how does this relate to human beings? And this is something that Christakis in particular, he looks at this a lot. So he looks at this study, he connects it to first children, and then what happens when you impose this television watching or constant TV watching, in particular, what researchers call rapid pace theatrical style entertainment. And what that basically means is if you're familiar with Mr. Rogers, think of like Mr. Rogers versus Harry Potter. So if you're familiar with Mr. Rogers, if you're not, Mr. Rogers was basically a show that was very slow paced, or not even slow paced. It was very it was moved at a very natural pace. So the camera was not jumping from screen to screen or from situation to situation. It was flowing in such a way that when you actually, when you're walking around looking at things, observing with your eyes, it moves at a very normal pace. That's what that show was. But now, rapid pace theatrical style entertainment has more flashing lights than what you could imagine, because you're moving from frame to frame very quickly. And that, in and of itself, also produces a mass of overstimulation, is what Christakis found in his research, and in other research that he did by himself, was that if you keep sitting in front of a screen and where the frames are moving too fast for your brain to comprehend, right? Because think of your eyes actually as cameras. So as you look around, and actually do this while you're watching, looking at this presentation, I want you to just look up. Just look up and look around you. Everything moves normally, right? You look at one thing first, and then your eyes kind of keep continuing to pan over to the next thing and the next thing. What doesn't happen is that your eyes don't see, like, for example, I'm looking up, I'm looking at my air conditioner. And then the next, as I'm moving my eyes don't automatically look at the front door, right? I have to gradually progress to looking at the front door. But now, rapid style theatrical entertainment, which would be something like Harry Potter, which would be pretty much something like any popular movie or television show, your brain can't keep up with that, and your brain becomes overstimulated, which is pretty much what happened to these rats. The television shows that they were listening to and the flashing lights, it was rapid paced. So they couldn't keep up with what they were looking at. And the sad thing is that this actually applies to humans as well, because when we're engaged in watching this type of entertainment, we can't keep up. Our brains can't keep up. We think we can, but we can't. And that actually has a negative impact on our cognition. And as this study in particular, they found this could actually lead to ADHD in children. And so, what happens when you're an adolescent, right? It spirals and things progress. So that's something to definitely keep in mind as we move more into like behavioral aspects of this research. So now moving, like, kind of switching gears, but we're going to connect again to like the cognitive implications. We're moving a little bit more now into behavioral applications. So what does viewing television do to our behavior? Well, there was a study done basically looking at desensitization. So they took it to themselves to not look at, any particular aggressive behavior, but they just wanted to see desensitization, if that is a thing. And they found that it was a thing. So what they did in this study was that they had a group of students, and the students were shown violent clips, funny clips, and sad clips. And they were hooked up to this machine, a skin conductance machine, and they were repeatedly shown all of those types of clips. And so the participants who actually came into this study, these students, they, many of them were already habitually watching violent media. And that means that they were they were already constantly watching that. And so now these researchers just showed them even more violent clips. They also showed them funny clips and sad clips. What they eventually found was that greater exposure to violent media content led to less psychological reactions. So what does that mean, right? That basically means the more and more these students engaged in watching violent media content, like on their own, and now being exposed to it even more in this study, they didn't have any psychological reaction to it. It was just like, it didn't phase them. So, for example, watching like, someone getting shot on one of these clips, it didn't cause any reaction in them, meaning that there was no emotional reaction in them. They were just looking at it like, okay, someone got shot. Big deal. That is a big deal. And it even if it's fictional, right? Because what these researchers were looking at and what they found and what other researchers were looking at and found is that your brain has a hard time deciphering. And I'm going to elaborate on that when we look at a particular study that highlights that. But they found that they were desensitized to violence because the thing about violence, especially in the context of scripture, it should bother us, right? It should bother us when we see violence, whether it's fictional or not. When we see harm being done, that should do something to you. Um, you know, because scripture, Jesus doesn't counsel, well, if you see violence in real life, then that should bother you. But if you see it on television, don't worry about it. You don't see things like that in Scripture. What you see in Scripture is abstain from all appearances of evil. So that doesn't even, he's not even just talking about evil, he's saying the appearance of it. You know, depart from those things, right? So that includes what we expose ourselves to on television. And as we saw from what Jesus said in Matthew 5:29, was that if what you're looking at is causing you to stumble, if it's causing you to sin, if it's moving you away from righteousness, which says thou shalt not murder, right? Or you should, basically the last six commandments have to do with our relationship to mankind, our fellow humans, and not hurting them. If you're looking at stuff where people are being hurt, or where any type of sin or unrighteousness is happening, stay away from that. And it's interesting that these studies that we've been looking at is actually pretty much telling people to stay away from it too, especially this one because you're being desensitized to it. You're not, it doesn't bother you anymore. And so the researchers found that particularly interesting in this study. And, even more interesting to that is according to U.S. Surgeon General, National Institute of Mental Health, and the American Psychological Association, media violence is a public health problem. We see that in Brown and Bukowski's article. They actually deem it as a public health problem. So this is something that we should take into consideration. And so basically, desensitization is literally this meme, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, probably have used it in your like on social media. You got this dog character here. He's sitting in a house that's on fire and he's like, this is fine. There is nothing wrong with this. This is basically desensitization, right? Your house is burning and it does not bother you. That's pretty much extreme, but the concept is there, or the principle is there, right? So now, what about in the context of aggressive behavior? So not only desensitization, because specifically desensitization, according to Brown and Bobkowski, is actually used to show a link between media violence and aggression. So now let's look at aggressive behavior. What do they say about aggressive behavior? Well, the thing about aggressive behavior is that if you engage in it when you're very young, sadly, it continues, right? So aggressive behavior in adulthood was predicted by exposure to violent television content, identification with violent characters, and perceptions of television violence as being realistic. I have that highlighted because we're going to look at a study that talks about fiction versus reality. And you'll find that pretty interesting. So even throughout adulthood, this stays with you. So the more and more you expose yourself to, in particular, violent media, aggressive behavior ensues. It starts in adolescence. Actually, it starts in childhood. I didn't include that quote, but in Brown and Bobkowski, they actually looked at this in children. They were talking about a study that looked at this in children. It starts in children, with children viewing, violent content, violent television content. And now, in the context of criminal behavior and arrest, well, television viewing of violent content, the more and more adolescents engage in that, it leads to criminal behavior and arrest. And that's pretty sad, right? That it actually continues. So adolescents that are most likely to watch violent content leads to criminal behavior in adulthood. So are these the types of things that we want to expose ourselves to? That is the question that we should ask ourselves. Another question that we should ask ourselves in the context of this, what we just read here, this quote about perceptions of television violence as being realistic, looking also at what we learned about mirror neurons, right? When you're looking at someone else do something, your brain is interpreting it as you doing it. Um, and as we looked at the different brain waves, like alpha, right? So you're in this relaxed state. Some researchers call it a lulled state. You're in this lulling state of mind. Um, with all of that, and also with your limbic system being activated, so now you're being controlled by your emotions and not your reasoning. So, in other words, if somebody wants to fight you, you're not saying, you know what, this isn't worth it. Let me back off. The more and more you engage in violent television content, violent content in general, you're in your emotions throughout the day, most of the day. And so what happens is instead of taking the higher road, you decide to fight them, right? And it spirals. So now some of you may be asking, well, this doesn't apply to me because I know that what I watch on television is not real for the most part, right? When you're watching these movies, television shows, I know that that's fiction. I know that it's not real. Has nothing to do with my personality. I don't want to be connected to it in any way. So why should I even continue watching this presentation? Well, there was a study done looking at a reality versus fiction. And let's actually move to that. And the thing about that is that your brain, what researchers have found and what they are continuing to find is that your brain can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. So there was a study done by Leon and his colleagues, and they were looking at, they basically had these girls play the piano, and then they had them imagine that they were playing the piano, so they weren't actually playing it, they were just imagining like their fingers on the keys and different things of that nature, and then they looked at what was going on in their brains, and they saw that the brain images were actually almost identical. And here's actually a little visual of that. So they showed that the brain really can't distinguish reality from fiction. It sees it all as the same. And so let's actually just look at this image up close. This was the actual images of their physical practice. So this is them physically playing the piano. And this was the mental practice. So this is when they were just thinking about playing the piano. Look at the correlations between these images here. They don't look very different. They're all kind of doing the same thing, aren't they? So what the researchers actually said in this study is that, based off of this, it doesn't really seem that we're able to decipher fiction from reality or reality from fiction, because looking at these brain uh, images that they were doing about those specific regions in their brain, your brain doesn't really know the difference. So I know that this was in the context of playing the piano, but the broader implication of this study was to look at reality versus fiction. And it really doesn't matter. See, with the brain, is it doesn't matter what you're engaged in, not necessarily. When you're looking, or when a basic principle is trying to be established, so like when your brain is just trying to decipher reality from fiction, it doesn't really matter what you're engaged in. It doesn't matter if you're engaged in watching a movie, or if you're playing the piano, or what other behavior you're doing. Your brain, it doesn't decipher things differently, so far as, well, now I'm playing the piano and now I'm thinking about playing the piano, and this, I'm going to look at this as totally different from anything else that I do. The brain doesn't really work like that. It works in a more detailed and broader sense. And so from this study, researchers were interested about this and concerned about this, because the implication was, well, what happens when we're engaged in other things, right? Like watching, like for example, watching television, right? Where a large portion of the movies, the television shows, it's fiction. So what happens when you look at that? Because what we like to tell ourselves is that, well, I know it's fiction. Yeah, in a sense, intellectually, you know that it's fiction, but now your brain is not seeing that. You're not, and the big reason why your brain's not seeing that, by the way, is what we've been looking at before. All the research that we looked at before. The mirror neurons, where you're looking at something or you're looking at someone else's behavior and you're interpreting it as you doing it. So now it's like, okay, that's me. Although you don't cognitively think that, it's an unconscious process in your brain. It interprets it as you. And now all of a sudden, your frontal lobe is suppressed, so you can't reason, right? So you may think that you consciously know that this is fiction, but really there's an unconscious process that's going on in your brain that's telling you, or that's not really telling you, but that's just kind of there saying that, I don't really know what this is. This kind of just looks like anything to me. And as we looked also with what Bukowski and Brown were saying, there's a perception that television violence is realistic, right? And I actually would like to see more studies done on just a broader sense, like any type of television that you watch, like what's going on in your brain with that. But you researchers understand and know now that the brain really doesn't distinguish from fiction and reality. And the main reason for that, like just general knowledge, your brain, it wasn't designed for television. It wasn't designed really for any type of media. God didn't have that in mind. Like, you know what? I'm going to have like this separate section going on in their brain that's specifically dedicated to television. And why didn't God do that? Because if you look back at the beginning, the Garden of Eden, was there any television? No. There were real relationships among people, and they did real things in the real world. So everything was based on reality, right? There was no such thing as fiction once upon a time. Fiction came as a result of sin. So that's why your brain really can't distinguish between the difference, because it's like, well, I wasn't even designed for this fiction thing, right? So this is something to keep in mind as we continue in the latter portions of this presentation. So now, substance use. So we've looked at aggressive behavior. What does television viewing, what does media viewing in general do to us, due to our behaviors in the sense of substance use? So what research has found is that there is alcohol galore in television, and this was particularly 1998, 1999, 75% of episodes of the top rated shows featured alcohol use, also other types of drug use, tobacco use as well, in one-fifth of the episodes. Comes from Brown and Bukowski. This was back then. Imagine what's happening now, right? Also, alcohol depicting movies, it led to adolescents starting to drink within 2 years. So more and more adolescents that watched movies depicting alcohol, in particular adolescents who did not drink like ever, the more and more they watched this, they began to drink within the next 2 years. So this begs the question, is what we're looking at, is it influencing our behavior in one way or another, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to specifically happen to you. For you, it could be something different, right? Also, smoking portrayals. So teens who watch more movies portraying smoking, they were twice as likely to smoke 2 years later. Very interesting. So what we're watching is having an effect on who we are. By beholding, we become changed, right? By what we look at, by what we observe, we become changed. We can either be changed to the glory of God or the glory of Satan. What do these things tell you? Alcohol, smoking. Is this the glory of God? No, this is the glory of Satan. So we have to be very selective and careful with what we look at on any type of media, right? And now another very interesting thing in a study that was talked about in Brown and Bukowski was that government-sponsored campaigns were not effective. So government-sponsored campaigns in the sense of trying to get teenagers to not smoke. So like they realize, okay, teenagers have a smoking problem. We got to put something out there to help them not smoke, right? So that is actually very not effective. So the principle here, actually what was talked about in this article, is that the more and more teens view something, especially if it's something negative, the more they're inclined to just do it anyway. So you're not teaching them to not smoke, even though that's what you think you're doing. What you're doing is you're still presenting cigarettes in front of them, right? You're still showing. So like a lot of these government-sponsored campaigns, I'm sure you've seen them. It shows these teens smoking in the beginning, and then what happens? if you continue doing that, right? That doesn't help because you're still showing smoking portrayals, right? You're still showing that behavior. And what it does is, again, the brain is not able to decipher fiction from reality. So, fiction in the sense of like even the government sponsored campaigns, right? Like, that is not actually something that happened. That's something that they constructed, they put together. But the brain is not seeing that. In an unconscious process. It's just seeing it like, well, that's real, like, and also that's me. So think of those things, right? Think of what we just learned about how it's very hard for us to decipher fiction from reality, and how our brains look at when we look at things, our brains are saying that's us doing it, right? And you see from that previous research, this is what it leads to. This is just a snapshot of what it leads to. Okay, so I want to actually shift gears for the rest of this presentation, the end portion of it, talking about social media. This is the newer media, right? Older media that was like television, things of that nature. What they call newer media is like social media. Same things were found here in newer media and social media, because some of you are like, well, I don't watch television. I don't care much about Netflix. I'm pretty sure you care about Facebook, right? Instagram, Snapchat, all of those things. I'm sure you guys are using that. The concerns, though, with social media is that internet compulsivity and social maladjustment can be addictive. So when you're compulsively addicted to or you're compulsively using the internet, um, you know, can kind of lead to social maladjustment because you're not spending time with people, and that could be addictive, right? And it is addictive. Looking at this study by Zhao and her and colleagues, what they found was that internet addicted teens had brain abnormalities and lower brain functioning of the higher governing parts of the brain. And what did we learn about the higher governing parts of the brain? Well, that has to do with the frontal lobe, right? Our intellect, our processing, our reasoning, our even organization, things of that nature. There were brain abnormalities and lower brain functioning in those parts. So they weren't using their higher governing system. They weren't using it. There were lower functions there. And also, what we learned in the previous study is that when that's not being used, something else takes its place. And that is the limbic system, where your base emotions, your base drives, all of that is controlling you, is what happens, right? So it happens in the older media, right? Like television and, things of that, movies, even going to the movie theater, things of that nature. Same thing is being shown in internet use, social media in particular. And what else happens with social media? What else does that lead to? Well, in this study that was done by Shaka and Christakis, this is another Christakis, not the other Christakis. They actually did this study on Facebook. They literally took a bunch of people, teenage years to adulthood, early adulthood. They had them actually use their Facebook accounts, do what they do, They had them they actually monitor like what they were liking, like liking other people's stuff, sharing links, posting status updates on their Facebook accounts. And they wanted to know, like, is this whole Facebook depression thing real? I'm sure you've heard of that. And they basically found that it is kind of. They found a 5 to 8% decrease in mental health. So they weren't. Their mental health was declining, right? They weren't feeling as happy and as good as they were feeling. They were feeling more depressed, actually, in particular, in this study. So they weren't feeling good. But now, they also, in this study, they didn't just look at social media use, in particular with Facebook. They also looked at real live relationships. They actually followed these people. It was a longitudinal study, meaning that they followed people from adolescence to adulthood, and they were watching them in the context of their friendships and just hanging out with people that they like. So when they actually unplugged, right, from Facebook, and they decided to engage in real life activities and things like that, they found that there was a positive association with well-being. So, basically in this research, what we're finding is that it pays more, it makes more sense, and it's better for you to have real relationships, to spend most of your time in real relationships, as opposed to superficial ones on Facebook, like even communicating with your friends, like just constantly on Facebook. In particular, in this study, they found that that led more to mental health issues, depression, things of that nature. So the principle here is to live fully alive is what I like to call it. The abundance of life that Christ freely gives to us when we ask for it. Is social media bad in and of itself? No. Social media can be used for a lot of great, wonderful things. Um, but is it good to be using it constantly? Doesn't seem to be so. Looking at this research, is it good to constantly engage in television, watching movies? This is including going to the movie theater constantly, television shows. Is that affecting you positively or negatively? And looking at this research, it looks like it's affecting us in a very negative way. So we have to be careful with what we look at, right? And so, what can we do? What do we do about this? There's several things that we can do. What In the Bible it says that the Lord God says, "My people perish for a lack of knowledge." Well, He wants us to have knowledge. He wants us to reason, right? So He wants us to use our frontal lobe. How do we know that? Because God said, "Come, let us reason together." And where is our reasoning? Our reasoning is in our frontal lobe. It's in our higher governing functions. And what happens is when we engage in this rapid paced theatrical style entertainment, be it the television, be it online, watching movies, TV shows, we got to be careful with what we look at because it's changing who we are and it's not allowing us to reason. So, what I have here are some resources that you can check out, really great resources. All of these resources are, it's basically two: Little Light Studios and also this documentary. It's a six-part documentary called Media on the Brain. It is done by a ministry called Belt of Truth Ministries. Both of these resources are Christian. These are from Christian ministries, and they just want to open people's eyes on what entertainment is doing to us. And Little Light Studios does a really great job with that. These ministries in particular have changed my life. I used to be totally engrossed in entertainment, and one day God tapped me on my shoulder, and He pointed me to these ministries, and I started watching their content about. The Little Light Studios does a lot of stuff about different movies, movies in particular. They have a documentary specifically on social media that they just recently did called #Selfie. They also have a documentary called Pseudology, and this is about the art of lying. So they're not teaching you how to lie, but they are teaching you about the lies that we are constantly bombarded with that we don't even realize. And so the implication here, or what I will leave you with from this presentation, and as you also explore these other resources, what is media in and of itself? What is it selling us? We know that it's selling us products, right? Buy this product, right? This is going to be great for you. But now, what happens when the media is selling us ideas? What happens when it's selling us the idea, in particular, that God is wrathful and He's the bad guy, and Jesus is the bad guy? He's not for you, He's against you. Jesus is not your savior, He's weak. And Satan, he's your savior. He's the good guy. He's the one on your side. He's the one who wants to set you free. What happens when the media sells us that? Is the media selling us that? And you will find when you look into these resources that it is. And we don't know it's happening to us. And we don't know it's happening to us because of the mirror neuron implication, looking at what you see, seeing it as yourself, decreased functioning in the frontal lobe, so you can't really reason with what you're looking at. You don't know if it's real or fake, and you're just being fed. What happens is we're just being fed with whatever message that movie or that TV show is trying to give us, and we can't even decipher what it is or what it's trying to tell us. And what inevitably happens is that our cognition suffers and our behavior suffers, because now we're moving from maybe righteousness to unrighteousness, right? We saw that in the alcohol use, the substance abuse, the aggressive behaviors. What are these things selling to us? So think about that. as you go away with this presentation, and definitely check out these these resources here. They go into what I have explained, and they go into it a little further, and they also look at the spiritual application of Gnosticism, this whole idea of the gospel flipped upside down in movies and television, and we can't even realize it because our cognition is suffering, because our frontal lobe is suppressed and our limbic system is increased, and we function only in our limbic system, or in the alpha state as well, and that poses an issue. So I want to thank you for watching this presentation. I hope that it has been helpful to you, and I wish you the best, and I hope that you do check out those resources. Thank you, and goodbye.